Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's seminar. I'm Nina Hall. For those of you who don't know me, I'm assistant professor here at SAIS Europe, based in Bologna. And I'm sitting actually in our auditorium, hence wearing this slightly odd mask. I'm not a dentist. And I'm hosting tonight's seminar on international relations and delighted to welcome to it Professor Jonas Tallberg, who's sitting in Stockholm, where I understand the snow hasn't quite fallen yet. Tonight's session will focus on the legitimacy of international organizations. And I can say I think this is a really important topic for all of those joining, whether you're thinking about it from a European perspective, a US perspective, Asia, Latin American. Many of our international organizations have been questioned, have had their legitimacy questioned, or if not completely attacked by people like the current president of the US, President Trump, but also by other actors. So tonight's session, I'm really delighted to unpack exactly what does legitimacy mean when we talk about it in the context of international organizations. For whom should international organizations serve, and how do we understand if the consequences if they aren't functioning? So to introduce briefly our speaker, Jonas Tallberg is the professor of political science at Stockholm University. And we had actually hoped to host him in person in Bologna. So I'm sorry that we aren't able to do that on this occasion, but hope we can welcome you another occasion here. His primary research interests are global governance and European politics. He currently directs the research program Legitimacy and Global Governance, which is funded by the Riksbanken's Jubileumsfond. And it's a large 5-year project of which he's just in the last stages of. And I'm sure he will speak about that project today, as there is a major co-edited book coming out of it with Oxford University Press on legitimacy in global governance's sources, processes, and consequences. Professor Tallberg has also written a number of other books, including The Opening Up of International Organizations, Transnational Access and Global Governance with Cambridge University Press, Leadership and Negotiation in the European Union, and European Governance and Supranational Institutions. His academic articles have appeared in journals such as International Organization, International Studies Quarterly, and the British Journal of Political Science. He's won numerous awards for his research and has been awarded research grants from a number of institutions such as the European Research Council, the Fulbright Commission, and the Swedish Research Council. He's been a visiting professor or a visiting researcher at Harvard University, Stanford, McGill, the VZB Berlin Social Science Center, and the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in München, amongst many others. So I'm delighted to welcome to speak tonight Professor Jonas Tallberg. He'll present his research for around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a time for question and answer at the end. And I would really welcome all of those joining both in the room and in Zoom to ask your questions, and please do so in the Q&A function so that we can keep track of them. Thanks very much, and over to you, Jonas.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks for the invitation to present tonight. I would have loved to escape dark Stockholm to visit you all in Bologna and have a chance to meet you in person and to see the city, but that is for some future occasion. Now I'm standing in my office in a deserted campus of the University of Stockholm, pretty much under lockdown. We are discouraged to be here at all, and like in Bologna, most of our teaching is actually taking place over Zoom, even though I understand that you actually have some in-person meetings. I'm very thankful for this opportunity to speak about the research that I and my colleagues are conducting on the topic of legitimacy in global governance. This is a topic that when we started designing our application for a big program grant 6 years ago was not as topical as it has become over this 5 to 6 year period. This was pre-Donald Trump, this was pre-Brexit, this was pre-COVID-19 and discussions around the WHO and pre-other types of challenges against global governance institutions around the world. My intention today is to divide the talk into two different parts. I want to say a few words up front about the Legitimacy and Global Governance Program, or the LegGov program. And then after a while, I'm going to shift to some current research that we're currently doing on the existence of an elite citizen gap in legitimacy beliefs with regard to global governance institutions or international organizations more generally. But the first part then will be devoted to, there we are. Let's see. Sure, there's the PowerPoint, very good. The first part then will be divided to the LegGov research program. And the starting point of this research program is really the realization that globalization of policy problems demands effective global governance.
Sorry to interrupt, Jonas. I don't think we can see the video, or are we? You need to share the screen, sorry.
Okay. There we go.
This looks like it's going to work now. And yep, and if you, yeah, perfect.
Much better.
Let's go.
Sorry about that. I thought we were still in the trial session from before. Okay, I'm not going to start over the presentation, but I'm going to say that I will divide it again into two parts. The first part will be devoted to the LegGov research program. And the starting point of this research program is really the realization that globalization of policy problems demands effective global governance. Consider climate change, consider food crises, consider transnational conflicts, consider pandemics like COVID-19, consider the financial turmoil that we experienced in 2008 and onwards, and consider migration crises like the one in 2015. These are all transnational problems. And as a result of these transnational problems, we've seen states empowering international organizations over time. And we have some recent research coming out of several research projects that points to the growth in the authority of international organizations over time in response to these kinds of transnational problems. Now, for international organizations to make a difference, it's not sufficient for them to have authority, to have power, but they also need to have legitimacy. And we start from the observation of the assumption that legitimacy is a requirement for global governance to truly make a difference. What then do we mean by legitimacy? Well, in our terminology, legitimacy is the belief or the perception that authority is being appropriately exercised. So we adhere to what's been termed a sociological or a descriptive or an empirical conceptualization of legitimacy, where legitimacy is really about the beliefs and perceptions among citizens, elites, and other types of political actors about international organizations. And this is different from the so-called normative understanding of legitimacy, where you judge the legitimacy of international organizations depending on how well they measure up to standards like democracy, effectiveness, and fairness, standards that are derived from political theory or political philosophy. So we're interested in legitimacy in this sociological sense, with a focus on beliefs and perceptions of an appropriate exercise of authority. And without legitimacy, there's much to suggest that global collective problem solving will be deeply challenged. So without legitimacy, it's going to be more difficult for international organizations to get the resources they require for their actions, to get the mandates and the authority that they need to perform their duties. It's going to be more difficult for international organizations to actually gain political support for ambitious policies in areas such as climate change. And it's going to be more difficult for international organizations to actually secure compliance with the rules that they develop, with the norms that they develop. So without legitimacy, global collective action or global problem solving is deeply challenged. Now, this leads us in this research program to ask a number of questions that we think come from this observation. To what extent are international organizations perceived or seen to be legitimate? In how far are such legitimacy perceptions different across countries, across international organizations, across organizations working in different issue areas, or even across the elite citizen divide? What are the factors that drive people to hold certain legitimacy beliefs vis-a-vis international organizations? By what processes are international organizations legitimized or delegitimized by actors who want to shape how all of us think about international organizations? And to what extent and how does the legitimacy of international organizations affect how these organizations operate and their capacity to actually solve the problems that justify their existence in the first place? Now, we bring all of these questions together in one overarching question, which is why, how, and with what consequences do global governance institutions, that's another name for international organizations, with a somewhat broader conceptualization of these institutions, why, how, and with what consequences do global governance institutions gain, sustain, and lose legitimacy? And what we aim to contribute in this research program then is to develop a novel theoretical approach to legitimacy in global governance, where we're joining others in this turn toward a sociological view of legitimacy in global governance, which is all about perceptions and beliefs about legitimacy. We move away from a focus that states perceptions of international organizations and actions in relation to international organizations are all that matter, to consider a broader spectrum of actors as audiences, from states and governments and elites to citizens, to non-state actors such as NGOs or business communities. We, in this project, also work with a comparative design insofar as we're not focusing on a single issue area such as trade or the environment, climate change, security, human rights, but we engage in a study of international organizations that are active in a broad set of issue areas or policy domains for that matter. Methodologically, we rely on a combination of classic qualitative methods like case studies and process tracing and structured focus comparison, and we combine that with quantitative methods such as quantitative content analysis, automated content analysis, surveys, and survey experiments. Substantively, we focus on three big issues in this program, and these have become the core of three themes and three research groups in our program as such. These are sources, processes, and consequences of legitimacy. And by sources, we mean the drivers, the factors that shape whether we as citizens or other political actors perceive international organizations as legitimate or not. By processes, we mean the legitimation and delegitimation actions by NGOs, politicians, and others who try to shape how we think about international organizations. And by consequences, we mean the extent to which having or not having legitimacy affects the capacity of international organizations to solve the problems that justify their creation. Altogether, then, we aim to provide the first systematic and comprehensive analysis of legitimacy in global governance. Now, fortunately, I'm not alone in trying to pull this off. We are a group of 16 researchers in Stockholm, Lund, and Gothenburg, 3 universities in Sweden. We started out being based in these 3 places. We're now slightly more spread out. Some of us are working in the UK, in Germany, and in the Netherlands. We're funded by Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, which is one of the 2 big basic social science funders in Sweden, for a 6-year period. And we've done 5 of these years. We have 1 more year to go. We published 1 volume in 2018, which intended to be sort of an agenda setting volume, setting out the big issues, the potentially useful theoretical angles and approaches, potentially promising methodological strategies. This volume was effectively carried the same name as the program as such: Legitimacy in Global Governance, Sources, Processes, and Consequences. Now, over the years since then, we worked to implement these promising research strategies. And in so doing, we've produced a number of articles, special issues, and chapters and edited volumes. But what I'm particularly happy about at this point is the fact that we are now working on bringing everything together in 3 concluding volumes for Oxford University Press. 1 volume for each of these 3 themes: the sources, the processes, and the consequences of legitimacy in global governance. This is ongoing work. Any input, any questions, are most welcome in this respect. Now, that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. Let me now turn to some current research that I hope will be interesting and intriguing for you. And this is research devoted to the issue of a potential elite-citizen gap in perceptions of international organization legitimacy. This is based on co-authored work or a co-authored paper, work I'm doing together with 3 co-authors, Lisa Delmuth, Sutke Verhagen, and Jarnar Scholte, all members of the LegGov research team. And it was very much work in progress, so any reactions and any feedback you might have are most welcome. In this specific part of the work that we are doing, we are focusing on the issue of whether elites and citizens hold different views of the legitimacy of international organizations, and if so, why they do so. This is a topic where research is rich in assumptions, but poor in rigorous answers. Now, if we go to the first question of whether there is a gap, there are those out there who say that, well, the rise in anti-globalist populism is a sign that we're actually observing a gap between elites and citizens. This populism as such and its success is an indicator that there is such a gap and that elites are out of touch with what people in general want and how they think of international organizations. On the other hand, there is also a large body of research in political science which suggests that elite and public opinion ought to go hand in hand, that there ought not to be such a cleavage between the two. We know that elites, especially political elites, tend to be responsive to the preferences of voters. We also know that political elites have a tendency or have a capacity to influence how we in the public tend to think about certain things. So for these reasons, there ought not be such a gap. Then we have the other question here. If there is a gap, then why is there a gap? Well, here there are contending theories out there that point to different causes, different potential reasons for why there could be a gap. Some would emphasize socioeconomics, and others would emphasize divergencies in ideology or in identities, and yet others would emphasize psychological dynamics such as degrees of difference in terms of institutional trust. But so far, we've lacked the data to identify whether there is a gap and what potentially drives such a gap. Existing research in this field is fairly rich when it comes to literature and prior work on public opinion toward international organizations, especially public opinion work specializing in the European Union is very rich. There's also some work on elite opinion toward IOs, but much less. And most importantly, there are almost no studies that are actually engaged in a comparison between elite and public opinion regarding international organizations. There's one piece from 2003 looking specifically at the EU, but with the exception of that, there's no work and there's no data available to compare elite and public opinion in a systematic fashion. The ambition of this paper is to provide a first systematic comparative analysis of elite and citizen views of global governance. So what we try to do in the work that we're doing in this area, and it's part of a paper, it's also going to be part of one of the 3 books for Oxford that I mentioned to you earlier. The first task is to assess the extent of elite citizen gaps in IO legitimacy perceptions based on 2 coordinated surveys. The second component is to develop a set of explanations for why we might see these gaps, explanations that focus on interests, identities, values, and trust, respectively. And then finally, we offer an explanatory analysis of these elite citizen gaps, and we do so with respect to elite and citizen opinion in 5 countries and in relation to 6 international organizations. If I turn to the research design, the cornerstone of the work that we are doing in our group of 4 here is really the coordinated data that we've been able to gather through 2 different surveys that were in the field in 2017 to 2019. to coordinated surveys. For public opinion, we cooperated with the World Values Survey and its 7th wave, which was in the field during this particular point in time. And we contributed a new battery of questions about international organizations to the World Values Survey. We have samples of about 1,800 to 3,000 respondents in each country. These are nationally representative samples, and these interviews were conducted either face-to-face or on the phone. For elite opinion, we conduct an in-house elite survey, which we term the leg of elite survey, and that is now publicly available. We cooperated with we covered some of the countries ourselves in-house. We cooperated with research teams, or we hired research teams in other countries, in Russia and Brazil, to help us carry out these interviews. In total, we interviewed 860 elite persons about their views about global governance and international organizations more generally, and almost all of these interviews were over the phone. We had a very ambitious set of master's students helping us out, trying to cover the different hours of the day to capture these hard to get elites around the world. Since there is no identified population of elites out there, for these purposes, we had to rely on so-called quota sampling, which means that we define the number of respondents we want to have in certain quotas. And these quotas are based on our conceptualization of elites and what we want to cover, as well as some additional considerations. We define or conceptualize elites as persons who hold leading positions in society that strive to be politically influential. And whereas most earlier work on elites in politics focus on political elites, that is either politicians or civil servants, we also include societal elites. And by societal elites, we mean elites who are active in civil society, in media, in business, and in academia. So we have 4 different sectors of societal elites, and we have 2 different sectors of political elites, the party elites and the civil servant elites, or the bureaucratic elites, if you want. And these also functions as the quotas when we put together the sample of elites that we interviewed for this project. We focus on attitudes toward 6 international organizations: the International Criminal Court, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the World Trade Organization. And we selected these because they're key governing institutions in their respective domains. They're also relatively well known, which is a precondition when you want to ask people about their legitimacy beliefs vis-a-vis an institution. They need to know about it before they can actually develop legitimacy beliefs about it, about an institution. And we also wanted to cover organizations that were active in economic governance and what we might broadly conceive of as human security governance. And I'll get to the reasons for that in a while, or some of the consequences of that distinction in a while. We conducted this work in 5 countries, in Brazil, in Germany, in the Philippines, in Russia, and in the United States. We actually also did elite interviews in South Africa, but we're unable to use those for the work that I'm presenting to you here, because the World Values Survey has not been able to secure the public opinion survey in South Africa yet. These are countries that signify or express diversity in political and economic conditions that might matter for elite citizen legitimacy gaps, by getting into domestic economic conditions, domestic political conditions, different geopolitical positions, but also different experiences with these international organizations as such. Still on research design, how then do we measure legitimacy beliefs, you might ask? Well, we ask about people's confidence in international organizations. There are a couple of different schools and alternatives out there, but we settled on confidence in international organizations for several reasons. One is that it fits with our conceptualization of legitimacy as such. Confidence, in a sense, it taps the reservoir of underlying faith that someone has in an institution, and thereby goes beyond just short-term satisfaction with the most recent decision it might have produced. It goes beyond that. It's a concept. That is a close neighbor, if not a synonym, to trust as such. So confidence and trust effectively go together in that respect. It's also a narrow measure, which is useful for our purposes, because there are those measures that in our analysis integrate aspects that we would think of as causes of legitimacy beliefs, or that others might think of as consequences or effects of legitimacy beliefs. We want to work with a narrow measure of legitimacy beliefs. And finally, it links to a growing literature that uses this measure of confidence or trust in international organizations. And by relying on this measure, we can also communicate with this literature and build cumulativity in our research on legitimacy in global governance. In the explanatory part of our work, we rely on a so-called dyadic modeling strategy. That means that we match each individual elite respondent to all citizen respondents in their country. And we then ask or inquire whether differences in explanatory factors in these dyads, in these pairs, are associated with differences in the same dyads or pairs as regards confidence in international organizations. And I mention this up front because the expectations that we then present are formulated in these sometimes somewhat awkward dyadic terms. So what do the data tell us? Is there a gap in elite citizen legitimacy beliefs vis-a-vis global governance? Well, the short answer is yes, there is. And I'm going to show you 3 cuts as a way of illustrating this gap. The first cut looks at the legitimacy gap by international organization. And this means that we pool the 5 countries and we pool the 6 different types of elites to focus on legitimacy beliefs among elites and citizens vis-a-vis the different international organizations that we cover. The light gray bars here are elite opinions. The dark gray bars are citizen opinions, and the black bars, those are the resulting gaps between the two. Now, if we start out looking at the absolute levels, we can observe that the legitimacy of international organizations is reasonably high among elites. It tends to be somewhere around elites, somewhere around the level of quite a lot of confidence in international organizations for elites vis-a-vis most of these international organizations. It's actually, confidence levels are actually highest in the World Health Organization. And this is interesting. This is pre-COVID-19. And I would have loved to do exactly the same study now, or even better in a year from now, to measure whether these levels of confidence in the World Health Organization actually hold up to the experiences over this year or these 2 years or so. We also find that the World Health Organization enjoys the highest level of confidence among citizens as such. If we look at the lower end of the scale, we find that the IMF is the organization that experiences the lowest level of confidence among both elites and citizens. Over at the far right hand, you see 3 bars for government. That's the average confidence that citizens and elites have in the respective national government. And you can put this in comparison to the international organizations. And it suggests the observation that national governments do not, in fact, enjoy more confidence than what international organizations do, which some might suspect that they would. If we now turn to the issue of the relative levels, or the gap as such, we can observe that there is a gap for all 6 international organizations. And it's a gap of 0.41 on a 0 to 3 scale. So the answers are 0 to 3, 0.41, that's the black bar on the far left. That's the average for all the international organizations. And that actually means that elites on average have 30% more confidence in international organizations than what citizens do. We find that the gap is largest for the United Nations and for the World Health Organization, and that the gap is smallest for the World Trade Organization. Again, it may be useful to compare with national governments. So if you look at the far right-hand side, then what you see here is you see a gap of 0.36, which is comparable to that of international organizations in general. So it's not really a legitimacy gap or a crisis of confidence that is exclusively experienced by international organizations, as the contestation against international organizations or of international organizations in recent years might have suggested. In fact, it's probably a contestation or a lack of confidence in political institutions in general that we are witnessing, if we are witnessing such a gap at all, or such a deficit in confidence or legitimacy at all. The second cut that I want to show you is that of the legitimacy gap by country. And this means that we pool the different international organizations and we pool the elite types to zero in on comparisons across the 5 countries. And what we observe here, if we focus on absolute levels, is that we see that confidence levels are reasonably high in Brazil and in Germany. We have medium levels of confidence in the United States, somewhat lower in Russia. And then we have an interesting deviation in the Philippines that I get to in a moment. Now, if we focus on the relative levels of confidence, or the gap as such, we find that there is a gap in 4 out of the 5 countries, and that the gap is largest in Brazil, and that is smallest in the United States. We also observe a very interesting exception, namely the Philippines. The Philippines is the only out of the 5 countries here where citizens on average, in fact, have more confidence in international organizations than what elites do. We've been quite puzzled by this finding, and we've gone back to check earlier versions, earlier waves of the World Values Survey to see if this is a pattern that stretches back in time. And it turns out that citizens in the Philippines generally, and over time going backwards, have been more positive than citizens in other countries in their attitudes vis-a-vis international organizations. Some of our colleagues who know the Philippines better than us, or have expertise in the area, suggest that it has to do with the domestic political situation, with elites that are perhaps more anti-globalist or anti-global governance than in most other countries, but especially citizens who look to international organizations as an escape from elites with a more nationalistic and authoritarian orientation. But your ideas and observations here are most welcome. The third cut then is has to do with legitimacy gap by elite type. And this means that we pool the international organizations and we pool the countries to zero in on the differences across elite types. Again, let me remind you that we're working with 6 different elite types. 2 are political elites, the party elites and the bureaucratic elites, and 4 are societal elites. The civil society elites, the business elites, the media elites, and the research or academic elites. And all of these elite categories are here compared to the same citizen average, namely the citizen average across all of these countries combined. And what we observe then is that we find a higher gap or a larger gap for bureaucratic elites, for research elites, and for business elites. And we find a smaller gap for media, party, and especially civil society elites. Civil society elites are those that are most attuned to or mostly share the perceptions of international organizations among citizens at large, which perhaps may not be all that surprising. So in sum, there's a notable and general gap between elites and citizens in their perceptions of legitimacy of international organizations. This goes for all 6 international organizations. It goes for 4 out of 5 countries, not the Philippines. and it goes for all six of our elite types. So how can we explain this gap? What are the factors that might drive this gap between elites and citizens? This means that we now take the step from this aggregate level to look at the individual level. And what we do then in our research here is to think about how this gap may be rooted in systematic differences between elites and general publics. And we build on and extend earlier theorizing about characteristics across various types of characteristics that may matter for opinions vis-a-vis international organizations. And we focus specifically on four sets of characteristics. People's socioeconomic status, their political values, their geographical identification, and their levels of domestic institutional trust. And in theorizing these, we try to bridge and also move beyond some debates in comparative politics and in international relations and in EU studies that highlight many of the same logics but use different terms for them. And we suggest that these systematic differences between elites and general publics, they may result both from selection processes and from socialization processes. On the selection side, it just might be that people with a stronger socioeconomic position, with more liberal values, with more of a global identification, and with greater trust in governing institutions opt into become elites essentially, that they are the ones who seek elite positions in society. In terms of socialization, it might be that once you are working in an elite category or in an elite sector in society, you are more likely to assume a liberal political outlook. You're more likely to develop a global identification. And you may be more likely to expand your trust in governing institutions. These are assumptions that we make, but we expect both of these processes to be at play and in creating the type of systematic differences between elites and general publics that we theorize. Now, I'm going to very briefly go through these four logics and just say one word about them. The first one then focuses on socioeconomic status, and it suggests that elites may be the winners of globalization, at least in compared to citizens at large. Elites tend to be better placed to benefit from globalization than what citizens are in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of investments, and so on. And this is actually a development that has been spurred by international organizations as contributors to globalization as such. And this generates an hypothesis that the higher the socioeconomic status of an elite individual compared to that of a citizen, the more legitimate this elite will find an international organization compared to this citizen. So this is a kind of dyadic construction of our expectation that I mentioned before. The second logic focuses on political values. If the first one was anchored in kind of a cost-benefit strand of theorizing, the second one is anchored in a tradition emphasizing political ideology as a driver of people's political opinions. And it focuses on classic political cleavages or classic political dimensions in politics. And the most classic one, of course, is the left-right dimension. But over the past 10 to 15 years, we've also seen the development of an additional one. And people use different terms for this dimension, but the distinction between green alternative liberal on the one hand and traditional authoritarian nationalist on the other hand has become a fairly established way of capturing this other political dimension that is good at capturing issues that fit poorly on the left-right dimension, such as attitudes toward the environment, toward gender equality, toward sovereignty issues, nationhood, and so on. And here the argument is that some of these political values are more supportive of international cooperation or global governance than other political values. And building on some recent literature, we suggest that people who hold more right-wing and more traditional authoritarian nationalist values are less likely to think that international organizations are legitimate. whereas those who hold more left-wing and green alternative liberal values are more likely to think of international organizations as legitimate. And if it is that elites then are of the category that they hold these left-wing or green alternative liberal values to a greater extent than citizens, then that would give rise to the gap that we have observed here. The third logic focuses on geographical identification, and this one taps into or builds on a larger school emphasizing identity, social identity as a driver of people's opinions. And here the argument is that support for global governance is more likely among people with a global identification as opposed to a national or local identification, which I think is a fairly straightforward argument. And we then suggest that if elites, to a greater extent than citizens, hold these global attachments, then that could be a factor explaining why they also are more positive vis-a-vis international organizations as such. And finally, the fourth explanation focuses on domestic institutional trust. And this one builds on an observation that people's confidence or trust in domestic and international institutions tends to be highly correlated. If you have high trust in domestic institutions as a person, you tend to have high trust in international institutions as well. And this is a correlation that has been found across a long range of articles using different time periods, different measures of legitimacy beliefs, different samples, and looking at different types of domestic and international institutions, from legislatures to executives and courts. And our argument here is that if elites have more confidence than in domestic institutions, they're also, than citizens at large, they're also more likely to have confidence in international institutions than what citizens at large do. So this gap between elites and citizens in terms of confidence in domestic institutions extrapolates or extends to their attitudes toward international institutions. So what are the findings? I'm going to give you a very simplified summary here of a somewhat more complicated regression analysis looking at the 5 different countries and the full range of international organizations. And I want to highlight a few findings or a few patterns for each of these explanations. The first one then has to do with socioeconomic status. And here we find some support for this logic with a measure that looks at the financial satisfaction of a household. In the Philippines, we find some support for the same measure in Brazil and in the Philippines. We also find some weak support for education as a measure of socioeconomic status in Germany. But the most important finding with regard to socioeconomic status is the wholehearted support for socioeconomics as a driver of the elite citizen gap in the United States. If we turn to the second explanation, political values, we have some findings here that are consistent with the logic that we expected. The findings in the US, again, are wholeheartedly in support of the expectations that we had with regard to the influence of political values. We also find some support for this logic in accordance with our expectations in Brazil. But then we have a finding in Russia that actually goes the other way from what we expected. In Russia, it turns out that when elites are more right-wing than what citizens are, these elites are more positive toward international organizations than what citizens are, which then cuts against the expectation. But again here, the take-home message is really that political values appear to drive the elite citizen gap in the United States and to some extent in Brazil. If we turn to geographical identification, we find support for this logic primarily and then strongly so in Russia, where cosmopolitan identification is positively associated with an elite citizen gap and national identification negatively, as we expected. We also find some findings that are in line with what we expected in the United States with regard to elites holding more cosmopolitan orientations than citizens also being more positive vis-a-vis international organizations. But we also have puzzling findings in the Philippines and among elites in the United States. And I will bracket for now, we're really happy to talk about later. Finally, we get to domestic institutional trust. And here, I'd like to point to two parts here. I mean, one is, of course, that this is the explanation that truly delivers in Germany. It appears that domestic institutional trust is the main driver of the elite citizen gap in the German context. But more generally, it is the explanation that comes across most strongly in all countries, with the exception of the United States, or that holds across all countries, I should say, with the exception of the United States. And when we do additional analyses where we include satisfaction with the political system here as the only indicator, because it is moderately correlated with confidence in government, then it turns out that there's actually more support for satisfaction with the political system across these countries as well. So for both of these indicators, there is quite some support in these analyses. One small issue that I want to mention here is that these findings all happen to vary. If we were to if we were to disaggregate this aggregate picture to look at what the findings are for individual international organizations, we would find that socioeconomic status and political values are the strongest explanations with regard to gaps in economic organizations. So for economic organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization, all organizations that generate distributional implications for people. For those, we see how socioeconomics and political values, and I would imagine particularly left-right, matter for people's opinions, and in terms of explaining the elite citizen gap, but not the same for human security international organizations. Let me summarize. We then establish in our work here that elites tend to have more confidence in international organizations compared to citizens at large. So we confirm this existence of an elite citizen gap. We find that this pattern holds for all 6 organizations, for 4 of the 5 countries, and for all of 6 elite types. We then, in our explanatory analysis, establish that this legitimacy gap results from elites and citizens at large varying systematically in a set of features that matter for attitudes toward international organizations. And I think this is an important but, there are differences, or these differences in characteristics, or how these characteristics matter, depends on varying contextual features as well. So we find that socioeconomic status primarily is a strong explanation in the United States and for economic organizations, that political values primarily is a strong explanation in the United States again, and Brazil, and for economic organizations. We find that geographical identification primarily performs well in the Russian context, and that domestic institutional trust has the broadest explanatory power, with the US as the partial exception here. By way of conclusion then, what are the broader implications of having established a gap like this, of having produced the research that allows us to say that there is such a gap, and that this is the multiplicity of factors that can account for this gap in legitimacy beliefs vis-a-vis international organizations? Well, one implication has to do with the debates that are ongoing in comparative politics between economic and cultural drivers of populism, and in international relations between non-economic and economic sources of public opinion vis-a-vis international issues and institutions. And what we effectively show here is that this dichotomy between economic and non-economic factors is a false dichotomy in a sense, and that these contextual conditions, we need to be sensitive to contextual conditions across countries to understand how different explanations interact in accounting for these gaps. A second implication is a strong reminder that international cooperation will face significant challenges since elites may not be able to count on support from citizens. There's a long tradition of work on global governance and international cooperation. Speaking of international cooperation, it's a two-level game where it can really truly advance at the international level if politicians can secure the support of domestic constituencies. And what we're pointing to here is a gap between those domestic constituencies and the elites that define the positions of governments in world politics. The third point is a more normative one. If we look at this gap from a normative political point of view, it's reasonable to think that, or reasonable to say that global governance may suffer from a problem of political representation due to poor opinion congruence. If we think it is a desirable standard that elites should be attuned to the views of citizens and should act in accordance with the views of citizens, then a gap between elites and citizens will present a problem of political representation unless elites also adapt how they act in view of what they know citizens think about global governance. And finally, I think this gap also suggests why populist politicians over a range, or in a range of countries over the past 5 to 6 years have found it profitable to target international organizations based on an anti-globalist discourse. If citizens are more skeptical of international organizations, there is this potential, in some countries, a tapped potential, in some other countries, an untapped potential to build on this skepticism toward international organizations and to play that up, or to politically play up an antagonistic position, a skeptical position vis-a-vis international organizations, and to secure domestic electoral support on that basis. Now, let me conclude with a very Swedish conclusion then. So for actors wanting to turn this tide and to work more in favor of global governance, reducing these differences between elites and citizens ought to be the priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonas. That was great, and a really fascinating level of detail you've got to through that research. So thank you for sharing it. I'm going to kick off a couple of questions, and then I will open up both the floor, and for those of you who are joining, which I can see are many remotely, I would ask you again to please ask your question in the Q&A, and you can start now to ask questions in the Q&A. So the first question I wanted to ask for you, Jonas, is do you think there are legitimate reasons that people are skeptical or have low confidence, as you put your measure, in international organizations? Because you're ending in the kind of implicit assumption, I think, is that citizens are wrong in some regards to have low confidence in IOs. And the second part to that question is, did you, through these surveys, gauge the strength of opinion? Because it's one thing to express a revealed opinion, but people might feel stronger about what kind of cheese they have in their sandwich than whether or not IOs are important or the extent to which governments are providing public services. So I guess here I'm asking is, it's one thing to reveal a preference that you have low confidence in IOs, but it's another to say this is a very strong opinion which I would vote a government in or out based on.
Well, thank you. Those were two excellent questions to start us off with. Now, are there reasonable reasons why people might be more skeptical? Well, I think that goes partly to our explanatory part here. If you think about socioeconomics, for instance, and socioeconomic differences as a driver of legitimacy beliefs and a driver of gaps between elites and citizens, I think it's fair to say that globalization has had distributional implications, across countries, but also within countries, such that some have benefited more than others from a process of globalization of which international organizations have been part. So unless those more adversely affected are actually compensated domestically, then it's not unreasonable that they will come out more skeptical of international organizations. Then I think it's, another possibility is, of course, to go to issues of whether international organizations live up to some of the standards, some of the expectations that we might have as citizens, with regard to whether they live up to democratic standards of decision making that we think are important, and also whether ultimately they're able to deliver in terms of helping us solve the problems on the ground for which they were created. Those are are trickier questions, and it's not obvious why elites and citizens would differ in those respects. But I wouldn't say that, I do not take the position that citizens lag behind elites in terms of their confidence in international organizations, because this is somehow not reasonable, or that they are somehow stupid in not understanding what international cooperation is all about. In fact, if we look at whether knowledge matters, it turns out that knowledge is not a very strong predictor of these differences between elites and citizens. The strength of the opinions. Well, no, we have not, directly measured the strength of people's opinions. I think it's fair to say that people rarely wake up in the morning thinking about international organizations. But if we remind them of them, then a relatively surprised, or a fairly large share of people actually do have opinions about international organizations, and sufficiently far-reaching opinions or well-developed opinions to be able to convey them to us in these kinds of surveys, making that a meaningful exercise. Well, and then that is not really an indicator of stability, but more of persistence. If we look at it over time, it turns out that at least in aggregate terms, people's levels of confidence in international organizations are quite stable over time.
Great, I'm going to open up for questions now. Both, if you have a question, please ask it in the Q&A, not in the chat, because that is where I can monitor the Q&A in the Zoom room. And those of you in the actual room, do we have any questions? Yes, and please introduce your name and where you're from.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Can you hear all right, Jonas?
I think so. Was it Mary?
Oh, no. Hi, it's Stephanie.
Stephanie, okay.
I'm Stephanie. I'm a first year from the US studying energy, resource, and environment. And my question is, when you were talking about the 6 different elite groups, I was curious if when you're comparing the different levels of confidence in between elites and citizens, if you broke up those elite groups based on the different organizations as well. And then when you're looking at the 4 kind of main reasons at the end that could be driving the differences, if you could link back based on those different elite groups, specific elite groups might be driving one of those different reasons. And then I guess also, are the elite groups evenly represented or in between the total elites, or do some elite groups make up larger proportions of the total elites?
Great, we'll go with that question unless, no, that's
Yeah.
Jonas.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's a great question. Now, with regard to disaggregating these elite groups and the opinions vis-a-vis international organizations, one could do that, of course. But if one does that, if one disaggregates these 6 groups, you do so by country, and then look at attitudes vis-a-vis specific international organizations, you would find some patterns, but you would eventually get down to a relatively small number of interviewees in each country. So we were talking about 100 elite persons interviewed in each country, a minimum of 100. And then we had also a global elite group of elites who are not nationally anchored, so to speak, but work in global media organizations or for international organizations or in global NGOs and so on. So about 100 per country, and then this elite group on top of that, making it altogether 860 elite persons. And breaking down those 100 per country, you eventually end up with a fairly low number of respondents in each category, which means that from a scientific point of view, it becomes a bit shaky. But one could definitely find such differences. But I would need to drill down, so to speak, and look at those. And any ideas on what you think might be particularly interesting categories to look at would be warmly welcomed in that respect. The second question was about the number that we had in each category. And here we have an equal division between political elites and societal elites, so a minimum of 50 in each category. But this means that the 2 subcategories among the political elites, the bureaucratic elites and the party elites, for those we have a minimum of 25, and for the 4 subcategories in societal elites, we have a minimum of 12 to 13 persons in each of these categories. So again, that's an illustration of how when we disaggregate like this, we come down to fairly low numbers. And that's despite a 2-year huge effort at getting these interviews, I can tell you.
Great. We have another question in the classroom.
Hello, my name is Noah Fywell. I'm a first-year student of General International Relations from the United States. My question is regarding the strongest indicator you had for trust in IOs being trust in national institutions. It seemed that your opening argument was that many of the problems we face can and will only be addressed by effective international governance. But the indication that trust in domestic institutions was a prerequisite for trust in international institutions, or at least an indicator for it, seems to almost suggest that we can't really begin to have effective international legitimacy until we have effective domestic government legitimacy, which is kind of a circular problem. So I'm wondering if there were any results in your research that spoke to that, or what your opinions are on that cycle.
Thanks.
That's a great observation and a great question. Some of that, as I said, there is this very strong correlation out there. It's the closest I have come in the work that I have done as a researcher to what might be called a generalization, or almost like a law-like relationship. Not having done work on the so-called democratic peace, this is the closest I get to a law-like relationship in social science. And it is this correlation between trust in domestic institutions and trust in international level institutions. Now, why is it that we see this relationship? Well, here research points to a number of potential reasons for why that is. Some suggest that people use their attitudes toward domestic institutions as a heuristic, that we actually do not have very well developed attitudes vis-a-vis international institutions. So when we're asked about international institutions, we cognitively go to our attitudes toward domestic institutions and then extrapolate those attitudes to international institutions. So it's a kind of cognitive help or cognitive tool that we rely on to make that deduction, if you want. Another argument that some have made is that people are a bit more rational, if you want. If they have confidence in their domestic government, and their domestic government in turn is represented on the international organization, and particularly in a country like the United States that has a lot to say about the direction of international organizations, then it would be rational to extend your trust in the domestic government to the international institution as such. And then we have a third argument, and that is one that I have myself pushed together with my colleague Lisa Delmut in some work, and that is that what is driving this association between domestic and international trust is actually an antecedent factor, whether we have generalized social trust or not, or our levels of generalized social trust or not. So if you're a person who tends to have extensive trust in people in general, then you're more likely to also have trust in domestic institutions and in international institutions, giving rise to this correlation between the two. So those are three different ways of trying to explain the correlation between the two. Now, the bigger issue that you're mentioning, of course, is the relationship between domestic governance and international governance. And I think that, for many, international governance still remains an add-on at the global level rather than the starting point for your thinking about politics. But I wouldn't say that it's a prerequisite. In some contexts, it's in fact such that the international level and global policymaking is an escape from the problems experienced domestically in domestic politics.
Thanks for that, Jonas. I have a question from the Zoom room, which is quite a specific question. So I'll ask this question And then it triggered another question for me. So the question from the Zoom room from Ludmila Minak is, what do you think about non-existence of the unique law regulating the activities of IOs in international employment law? And this questioner argues that employees of international organizations are frequently left unprotected and do not always have an opportunity for a fair trial in the ILO AT, as not every organization is part of it, and many have their own internal tribunal to resolve the issue around organizational harassment and discrimination. Does it not delegitimize IOs? So I guess the question here is about staffing practices in IOs and how professional they are. And I'm not sure, given that ILO isn't one of your case studies, whether it's something you can speak to, but it did trigger a second question, which you may be able to speak to as well, which is many governments have done evaluations of IOs and their performance. Here I'm thinking of DFID, the British government's development institute. They did them about 5 years ago, and they actually graded the performance of a range of IOs, including ILO. And I wonder to what extent you'd factored in some of this analysis into your broader thinking around legitimacy. So there's two questions, a specific one, if you can, around ILO and employment law, and a second one more about government's evaluations of performance of IOs.
Thank you. Thank you, Ludmila. With regard to the first question, I'm not sure that I will be able to answer it and give you the answer that you want to that question, but let me share with you a reflection related to the topic that you're mentioning here, namely issues of legitimacy in relation to the staff of international organizations. Now, some of our colleagues have looked at what they call legitimation and delegitimation practices. And legitimation practices are really discursively how the international organization tries to communicate its own values and its own image to the outside world. But it's also about how that international organization communicates its values and its image toward its internal audience, the staff who actually work for this international organization. And Sarah von Billerbeck, active in the UK, is working on this particular topic. He calls it self-legitimation. It's about how the international organization is communicating as a way of trying to reach its own internal audience and to kind of motivate it to try to convey the values that are the appropriate ones and so on. Now, the example that you're mentioning or your question suggests that they might not always be succeeding, and that in fact there are some problems with regard to, for instance, employment law for staff who are working for international organizations. The second question then was whether the performance of international organizations, as mapped, for instance, by several governments, including the British one, whether that shapes or influences legitimacy perceptions. So that's at least how I interpreted the question as such. We don't get at that issue in the work that I just shared with you, but in some other work. So we have conducted survey experiments where we confront people where certain treatment groups get descriptions of international organizations where we vary the extent to which they perform well or deliver well in terms of what they are about or what they're supposed to achieve. And then we have a control group that does not get such a description. And then we ask the question of confidence, and on that basis, we can ascertain whether a description or whether information about an international organization performing well in some capacity, in mitigating conflicts, in reducing climate change, and so on, actually helps to drive legitimacy perceptions. So we've done that for performance. We've also done the same kind of analysis for procedures, which is the other side of the institutional coin, if you want. So whether it matters for people's perceptions of legitimacy, whether an organization is presented as being more democratic, being more transparent, being more impartial, and so on. And what we find here in these two survey experiments I'm talking about here is that performances and procedures matter for people's legitimacy beliefs. And we've shown through these experimental methods it has this impact. And this is a better way of trying to get that whether performance and procedures matter for legitimacy beliefs and actually observing real world international organizations and links between evaluations and aggregate patterns in legitimacy beliefs, because there could be a whole range of reasons for why the World Health Organization, for instance, is perceived to be more or less legitimate. It could be performance, it could be procedures, it could be a range of other factors. But in these experimental settings, we can really isolate exactly what it is that is driving it.
Interesting. We have one more question in the Zoom room. Are there any more questions here in the auditorium as we take the last round? All right, I'll ask Sneha's question, and then it looks like Stephanie has a second question. So Sneha's is a question and a clarification. She says she wants to clarify whether or not your research pointed at how a surge in populist movements and governments reduce level of confidence in international organizations. And if so, did your research lead to any patterns or trends that sort of explain that? I think that's what she means. That's Sneha. And I wonder, underlying that question to me is a question of changes over time and whether or not the particular period you're studying of 2017 and 2019, I guess, when you took the survey, might lead you to the results that you got. Are you right to take one more question and that will be the final one?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. We'll take one more from the room then.
Hi, yes, I had a question just combining some of your older work in your piece, The Path to Compliance, where you look at sort of the management enforcement ladder, driving effective compliance within the EU, and then taking some of your legitimacy work and maybe looking at legitimacy in EU between and across different member countries in the work on implementing and now the work on adhering to the new European Green Deal.
Great.
Okay, great. So first, the question about populism and the extent to which what we identify in the project with regard to varying levels of confidence in international organizations could somehow be related to the surge in populism. Well, what I tried to convey there when I outlined the concluding implications was that I think the gap that we have established and that many suspected was there has been well exploited by populist movements over the past 5, 6, 7 years. I think that many populist parties are not, it's not a core of their agenda necessarily to be anti-international organizations, but it's become a classic ingredient in a sense of a populist discourse in politics. And part of the reason I think is that it activates these sentiments and it activates this gap in a sense that exists between citizens and elites. And it means that populist movements can exploit the greater skepticism in the general population vis-a-vis international organizations for political purposes, and thereby, in a sense, help them rise to power on that basis. I think that is also how we should understand many of the anti-EU parties or EU skeptic parties that we're observing across Europe. They are way more constructive when they serve in the European Parliament than when they campaign about the EU and try to secure domestic electoral votes by way of their Euroscepticism, so to speak. Changes over time. Well, that's the downside of doing this kind of study during a particular time period, is that we don't really have this longer time horizon. Now we can go back in time and look at whether patterns for citizens more or less hold up, and they tend to do so. It's quite stable, in fact. If I had shared my presentation again, I had a couple of resource slides there, but I'm not going to show them. I'm going to describe instead what we see there. What we see is that average confidence in the United Nations has gone through a slight decline over time from the 1990s up until 2015, and then it's actually risen over the past 5 years. trust in the EU is nowadays at more or less the same levels as it was in 1973 when they started measuring this, and at the same level as it, almost at the same level as it was in the early 1990s when it was at its highest level. But trust in the EU has fluctuated over time, and it's fluctuated with other developments in Europe and domestically, such as the 2008 financial crisis, and especially the euro crisis from 2010 to 2015. That really hurt trust in the EU. But then it recovered, and now it's up to a decent level again. Some countries, and I think Italy is the one that stands out there, has gone through a tremendous change in how the Italian population in general is looking at the EU. But in other countries, we see the flip side of that. We see very high numbers of trust in countries like Poland, where the government is Eurosceptic, and in countries like my own, Sweden, that traditionally has been quite skeptical of the EU, but nowadays is quite positive. So the EU is also holding quite steady. We see rising trust or confidence or support for the African Union and for Mercosur in Latin America. So there's not this long-term secular decline in the legitimacy of IOs that some would have suspected. Then we have the nice question, requiring me to think back and link back to my older work and to try to think of how this ties in with thinking about paths to compliance. And I think I might be able to say a few words about the first part of that, but not necessarily tied to the European Green Deal. Now, in that earlier work, I pointed to two different drivers of compliance or non-compliance. And one was more of a cost-benefit logic, where a member state complies or does not comply with European rules or international rules, depending on the type of adjustment costs it is required to carry. And if it faces big adjustment costs, then it's more likely to fail to comply. And in such cases like that, you need enforcement. You need sanctions to make it hurt, in a sense. The other logic is that of the so-called management school that emphasizes that it's more a question of ambiguity, that states in general want to abide by the rules, but there are sometimes difficult to understand contractual obligations. It might be that you're suffering from capacity problems on the economic side, on the technical side, on the political side, that force a member state into non-compliance, in a sense. And in such cases, you don't need punishment or sanctions through enforcement. What you need is more a management strategy. You need capacity building. You need transparency. You need dispute settlement, and so on. Now, where does legitimacy fit into this? Well, some have suggested that legitimacy is actually a third type of logic. The legal scholar Thomas Frank speaks of legitimacy as a compliance pull, that if an institution has a strong legitimacy, it's more likely to generate compliance from subjects, because people will experience that complying is the right thing to do, in a sense. So when I started out this presentation by speaking about how legitimacy is almost a requirement for effective global governance, I think I was alluding to that notion that legitimacy can be expected to have this positive effect on state compliance with international rules. Now, if we then finally take this step to the European Green Deal, I would say that the European Green Deal can very well help to work on that second driver, the capacity limitations that many states may have experienced now during the corona pandemic, in terms of keeping businesses going, of making sure that the healthcare system can deal with the situation, and that these economies come out of the pandemic reasonably strong and sound. And if they don't, then that is likely to have negative repercussions for their compliance with European rules. And if I make that link then to legitimacy, we might also see that negative socioeconomic consequences will lead to an undermining of confidence in an institution like the EU, but also in an institution like the World Health Organization that put health concerns above economic concerns.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonas, for a fantastic talk. I think it's really wonderful opportunity for us all to hear the level of detail that your team, you and your co-authors have collected on international organizations, and compiling both data from the World Survey as well as from your own survey of elites. And I think one thing that will rest with me, at least, about this is, if elites do have different views, can they then be part of the solution of addressing crisis of legitimacy? I'm thinking here particularly of the WHO and the report that's currently being written by Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and Helen Clark, both very prominent political leaders, former head of the United Nations Development Program, Helen Clark, and what role that will play if that report comes out with some solutions, how that will play out for both the WHO and the legitimacy of that organization. But I want everyone here to have a big round of applause, and those of you in the Zoom room as well, because it was a really fantastic conversation, and I hope we can look forward to seeing the final results of that project.
Thank you all for attending, and thanks for good questions.
No problem, and enjoy the rest of your evening in Stockholm.